So to set the stage for the conversation, for my part, I want to start with two acknowledgements. The first acknowledgement is not one that will come as a surprise to any of you. It's been a difficult year in so many ways. So I want to acknowledge the suffering and the challenges of the past year, while also recognizing that people experienced the pandemic really differently, depending on their position within what are long-standing structures of inequality, of racism, and exclusion. And I think those structures and those inequities are really fundamental to any discussion of the Plantationocene. So they're very appropriate for us to acknowledge and to, of course, discuss. Second, this is a conversation about land. And I want to start off with an acknowledgement that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, or the Cayuga Nation. The Cayuga Nation precedes the establishment of Cornell University of New York State and the United States of America. I acknowledge that Cornell benefited from the dispossession and alienation of these lands, and I recognize the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and to the waters. So in the next 20 minutes, I'll outline one main argument. Some of the presenters who follow me over the next 2 days will agree with this argument or find it generative at the very least, and some or many will disagree. But all of them, I think, will provide more details on agrarian life from different places and times. And I think the cumulative effect of all of these presentations will be to shed light on the system as a whole. My argument today is that the modern era has been so fundamentally shaped by the plantation that we can best understand it as the Plantationocene. The Plantationocene is a fairly recent concept. It was first suggested by Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing in a conversation organized by Greg Mittman and others at the University of Wisconsin. But if the concept of the Plantationocene is a recent one, it sits on the shoulders of hundreds of academics in a variety of fields, from anthropology and geography to critical race studies, Southern studies, law, economics, soil science, crop science. More importantly, though, the concept sits on the shoulders of thousands of activists, hundreds of thousands of activists across time and around the world, activists who have fought and who continue to fight for access to land. I don't have very much time today to make what is a huge argument, so I can't bring in a lot of detail from my own research, but my ideas about the Plantationocene are grounded in years of qualitative work on rural development in Brazil and Mozambique. In both of these places, I've been struck by the power of the plantation as an aspiration. There's this longing for orderly, well registered or visible to the state, modern agricultural production enterprises where humans and nature and machines are bent to the service of production and profit. As is the case in many places around the world, those aspirations seem to become an end in and of themselves rather than a means to an end. So the first question then is, what is a plantation? Plantations are large-scale monocrop or single product production units historically dependent on enslaved or forced labor. They're designed for extraction, dominated by the logic of market exchange, territorially possessive in that they claim land, but fickle, they can move, self-contained, but also incomplete without the global market. Dispossession has been key to bringing land and labor together in plantations, although the way in which this has been done is very historically and geographically specific. So plantation communities and plantation products look different across different times and places. At the same time, the plantation represents a model of, and even an imperative for, production that has essential similarities across space. Historically and today, plantations have wielded tremendous discursive power as idealized landscapes of production, profit, and property, as well as orderly or organized nature. If indigeneity had an empirical antithesis, it would be the plantation. There were plantations before the modern era, of course, but only in the last 500 years has the logic of the plantation crystallized, both theoretically and historically, into a coherent way of organizing the world. Some date the rise of plantations or latifundia to ancient Greece and Rome, along with the development of a landed gentry, of citizenship and slavery. But it was in the context of feudalism in Europe that plantations began their truly global spread. Led initially by the Spanish and Portuguese, European nations laid claim to new commodity frontiers through force, religion, often forced religion, and an ever more elaborate set of rules. This theft of land would be repeated over and over again in the name of the plantation, of productivity, of civilization, and profit. Plantations are generally associated with agriculture and rural areas, but as Sidney Mintz famously described, resources extracted from sugar plantations in the New World underwrote the birth of industry and urban settlement and arguably provided the impetus and even the model for factory and energy production. It is clearly not the case that all of colonial conquest happened through plantations, or that all agriculture was or is in plantations. But colonial rule and plantations went hand in hand, extracting resources from far-flung lands and creating, I would say, many of the divisions that we have today. Divisions between rich and poor countries, between the landed and landless, white and non-white, and rural and urban. The plantation fed the first and second industrial revolutions, fostered the creation of a world market, and fueled the deadliest aspects of socialism in the former Soviet Union and in China. Today, plantations control most of the world's arable land. Smallholders, who do constitute the greatest number of farms and of farmers, but smallholders who don't directly labor on a plantation are still usually shaped by plantation dynamics and interests. Roughly 15 to 20% of smallholder farmers around the world, although this varies widely by country and by crop, roughly 50 to 20% of smallholder farmers around the world are tied to plantations through contracts. For these farmers, as well as for independent producers, the playing field they operate on is shaped by government preferences and privileges for large-scale agriculture. This very brief initial discussion or description of the Plantationocene begs the question of how this concept compares to the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene. And I can't go into this in detail, but just quickly, I think it's fair to say that all three of these concepts are primarily political ones. They have not been blessed by the geophysical union. In that regard, the Anthropocene has been useful for focusing attention on the role of humans. So politically, it's quite powerful to show how humans have been involved in inducing climate change. But it's been critiqued quite effectively for the relative lack of power in the concept. The focus is on population growth as the driver of ecological change, where humanity is a relatively homogeneous mass, undifferentiated by wealth or power or race. The Capitalocene, as conceived by Jason Moore, is a useful alternative. It highlights the destructive nature of industrial production and draws attention to the material and social forces and relations of production. But capitalism alone, I agree with Donna Haraway and others, is too recent, too abstract, and too incomplete, given its inability to account for alternative production systems, such as socialism. The strength of the Plantationocene concept lies precisely in the failures of both the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene. Plantations are inherently power-laden, racialized social structures found in every modern economic system. So let me highlight 4 key characteristics of the modern era that the Plantationocene helps us to understand and to center in our analysis. There are others I could have chosen, and hopefully other speakers in the next 2 days will pick up on those or will address those, but I'll focus on racism, on inequality, on the degradation of human and ecological health, and finally, but very much not last, on resistance. Plantations didn't create any of these things, but they thrived on them and perpetuated them, and we can say that they were co-constituted. So first, plantations were rooted in dispossession and enslavement, and the plantation form continues to rely on coercion and force along racial lines. Colonization itself forcibly removed millions of people from their lands to labor and die on plantations elsewhere. This dependence on total control over the less than human became baked into planter mindsets. And because political control in so many places, the political control of the state originated in control over land, the enslaver mentality influenced the formation of states, of markets, and society. In Brazil, planters were so dependent on enslaved labor that even after abolition in 1888, they treated free laborers poorly enough that other countries banned or discouraged their rural poor from emigrating to the country. In yoking labor to plantations, European rulers uprooted native populations, destroying indigenous communities, as Michael Watts showed us in Silent Violence, and then fixing them again in villages and settlements, reservations, and towns. European notions of settlement came to be equated with civilization, and whiteness was key to all of this, conferring the right to subjugate and supporting the legitimacy of colonial claims against all other uses and relationships. This watershed moment, as Judy Carney calls it, normalized and naturalized what Catherine McKittrick calls a plantation logic. Placing the plantation at the core of the modern era requires that we center what Brenna Bander calls racial regimes of ownership, contemporary structures and acts of racist violence such as inequality, dehumanized police treatment, incarceration, redlining, extraterritorial jurisdictions, and so on, should be seen not as inevitable, but as inherent in a system shaped by the forced labor of the plantation. The second legacy of the plantation that I want to address is the way in which it still serves as the primary answer to the so-called problem of development. Over the last 100 years, economists and policymakers alike have taken their cue from British history in attributing growth to the rise of private property, wage labor, and surplus capital. Development, therefore, is seen as achieved through the modernization of large-scale export-oriented agriculture, rather than through the cultivation of smallholder systems. Land enclosures and related dispossessions are deemed necessary to creating a mobile wage labor force and efficient large-scale agriculture, usually for export. In Mozambique, where I've worked over the past several years, Portuguese scientists and politicians cataloged the different regions of the country in the territory in the early 1900s, not to understand what was already there, so much as to decide which global commodity crops could be grown in what region most profitably for the European market. Over the course of almost a century, colonial plans for cotton, tobacco, coconuts, and rice failed to make the Portuguese rich, but this hasn't stopped the independent state from mimicking the colonial one in agriculture. This time, though, the scientists are rarely Portuguese. Instead, they're Brazilian or European or American, funded by well-meaning aid agencies and still obsessed with large-scale agricultural estates that will modernize production and employ the rural poor as contract farmers and laborers. An important corollary of the reliance on large-scale input-intensive export agriculture as a development model is rapid urbanization. The concentration of land holdings and modernization of production has pushed smallholders, rural laborers, and other land users, such as indigenous peoples, into cities around the world. Latin America is an excellent example. The region went from being 25% urban in 1950 to 75% urban in 1985, in just 35 years. Very few cities in the region or elsewhere were able to house, feed, and employ the millions of immigrants. And so urban slums and the informal economy are defining features of post-war development. The third legacy of the plantation is the degradation of human and ecological health. Plantations and plantation crops dominate agricultural and industrial production around the world. Almost all public or charitable funding goes to just 6 commodity crops: cotton, wheat, rice, corn, sugar, and soy, in part because these crops are amenable to processing, serving both industry and agriculture or livestock needs, and feeding into a massive global system of processed and refined foods. On the face of it, the productive capacity of this system is mind-blowing, and yet almost 1 billion people go hungry, and another 1 billion are considered poorly nourished. Phil McMichael and others have written about the United Nations Food Systems Summit, arguing that in spite of significant evidence suggesting that reliance on these crops is unhealthy for humans and for the planet, they continue to be privileged by global scientific networks and by national and international agricultural policies. The reliance on large-scale commodity agriculture, in turn, has serious environmental consequences. Such agriculture is often input and energy intensive at the point of production and at the often distant point of consumption. Today, vertically integrated agricultural chains are estimated to be responsible for at least 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. A climate-friendly diet would likely be significantly higher in local fruits, grains, and vegetables, and dramatically lower in meat and processed foods. At the same time, many scientists have documented the relationship between deforestation, plantation production, and disease. This is a particularly appropriate connection to make right now. In Ireland in the 1800s, the transition from smallholder production to large-scale monocrop estates set off the Irish potato famine. Today, new work on COVID-19 by many of our colleagues suggests that the virus is at least partly due to deforestation and agricultural intensification, pushing the rural poor in China into smaller spaces where the hunt for wild species is increasingly difficult and wet markets are increasingly crowded. So this has been a sort of bleak description of the Plantationocene, but the story of the modern era would of course be incomplete without a discussion of the constant and ongoing resistance generated by land dispossession and forced labor. From the levelers and the diggers, to the Underground Railroad, to the Brazilian landless movement that you see here, and to many of the movements that people represent here today, humans and non-humans who would make their living on the land differently, outside of and in opposition to plantations, or inside plantations in small spaces, they abound and they even flourish. I first encountered the landless movement, or the MST, in Brazil in 1993. Almost 50 years after their founding, they're still fighting to dismantle the plantation economy and society, both one plantation at a time and as a world system. And the MST isn't alone. Over the entire modern era, the defense of land has inspired passionate resistance, from everyday life to armed rebellion, to participation in national revolutions, to organizing social movements, to the establishment of escape routes through migration, in the hopes of acquiring the resources to nourish the farm back home. Movements show us the possibilities for new relations of production and social reproduction, but wider political support, civil society, state, and market is necessary to provide the resources and the space for movements to flourish. Naming the Plantationocene for what it is connects land-based movements all over the world to movements fighting for fair wages, for an end to racism, for secure housing in overcrowded cities, for climate justice, and more. If the plantation is fundamental to the modern era, then so too is resistance. And I know many people in the next 6 panels will speak to this. So with that, I want to make sure that we have time to bring on the panelists for the 11:30 panel. The real excitement I have to hear all of these different talks is the way that the speakers come from very different places and spaces and very different approaches, whether as activists, as scholars. And so I think that we'll see some of the diversity across the planet, and also think about whether or not, or in what ways, there are connections or similarities. So I'm very excited. And before I go through some of the rules, I want to say thank you to all of my colleagues and friends who agreed to participate in the conversation. There have been some people who've had to drop off in the last week or so, and it's testament to all of your persistence and graciousness that you have hung on in spite of the current situation. In the audience, we have people today who do incredible work, and work that I have drawn on for many years. So I'm really thrilled to have us all in one Zoom room together. I also want to say a huge thank you to this incredible team in Einaudi and in the Migrations Initiative. That's the Einaudi Center for International Studies, and particularly to Scott Beamer, who has pretty single-handedly organized this whole messy meeting over the next 2 days. I don't know if he thought that we would be hosting this many people on Zoom, but I have so appreciated all of his work.